Our distinguished Mr. Anthony Castellanos will be giving some remarks, kind of a state of energy, to help set the conversation and frame the discussion moving forward. Anthony?
Great. Hi, Carmen. Thank you, and hello, everyone. I'm really delighted to be with you all today, and also to be a new member of LCDA and be part of this great organization. KPMG, as some of you may know, is the LCDA's Diamond Founding Sponsor, and we're extremely proud of our support of the LCDA and the Latino Corporate Directors Education Foundation to increase diversity in U.S. boardrooms, help enhance the skills and visibility of current and future Latino board talent, and advocate for greater Latino representation on corporate boards. At KPMG, diversity and inclusion is everything to us, and we apply it regularly in our business, and it's important that we support this great organization that I'm now a part of. Today, I'm happy to introduce our Fireside Chat, Energy on the Front Lines, featuring two business leaders that employ tens of thousands of people across the country and provide power and energy solutions to millions of residential, commercial, and industrial customers in nearly every state. Their operating models have been tested throughout the pandemic, as you'll hear more from them later, with significant fluctuations in input prices, demand, and shifting how they work with customers and the communities facing economic challenges. And as usual, we have severe weather to deal with, as they may even refer to in the last couple of weeks, affecting the East Coast and the Midwest of our country. According to KPMG's Global Energy Institute, COVID-19 has challenged utilities to rethink their business continuity planning. For example, a remote workforce isn't possible in every circumstance. Think about control rooms and employees working closely together to tackle outages. Also, think about supply chain challenges and capital planning associated with capital projects that are just harder to plan, and cyber threats that are greater now than ever before, as working from home has increased access points for malware to exploit. And of course, consumer hardship will continue to place increased financial pressure on the utilities firms, and you'll probably hear a little bit more from that from our panelists today also. Like every business, our firm, my clients, all of you are consumers, and we're all keenly interested in the importance of safe, reliable, and sustainable grid. And my partners who lead our energy practice tell me that energy companies have really been empowered to double down on their efforts around sustainability, inclusion, and safety and reliability. And again, we'll hear more about that from our panel. So without further ado, I'd like to hand it over to Pedro Pizarro, President and CEO of Edison International, and Joe Dominguez, CEO of ComEd, and also a member of the LCDA. They'll be interviewed by LCDA member Grace Liebland, a former executive of General Motors and a director at several public companies, American Tower, Honeywell International, and Southwest Airlines. So with that, Grace, let me hand it over to you to take us through the rest of the session with our panels.
Great, thank you. Thanks, Anthony, for your opening remarks. And good morning and good afternoon to everyone, and welcome to our Fireside Chat. I'm so pleased to be part of this very interesting discussion with Joe and Pedro, and all of you. Our infrastructure is one of those things that we take for granted 99.9% of the time because it works. However, the few times that our access to power or internet or water goes down, we realize how important our infrastructure companies are to our very existence. These companies are all about disaster preparedness and resiliency. As protectors of the grid, the energy industry plans for and responds to numerous foreseeable hazards. Yet the black swan events from this year have been unprecedented, and many industries and boards have been forced to react and adapt. In this session today, we're going to explore early responses, adjustments since, and how the energy industry is working to shape the new normal. So let's get started. Pedro and Joe, our participants, have read your very impressive bios, but can you tell us a little bit about your career trajectory and a past experience that you confronted that helped you in your immediate response to the pandemic? So we'll hear from both of you, and we'll start with Pedro on this one.
Hey, thanks a lot, Grace, and thanks to Esther and LCDA for setting this up and inviting us. It's terrific. In terms of my career trajectory, I grew up in Puerto Rico, and so maybe jumping ahead to part of the last part of the question, I grew up with hurricanes, and I grew up with, frankly, what was then and sadly still is in Puerto Rico, a weak power grid. So there were a lot of power outages when I was growing out, and a lot of hurricanes too, and so that builds that mindset. In terms of my career trajectory, I actually thought I was going to be a medical doctor at one point, and then a scientist. I got a degree in chemistry and a PhD in chemical physics chemistry, but took a left turn and decided to go check out McKinsey & Company and was a consultant there for a while. Edison was a client. I got recruited. I thought I'd be with Edison for a couple of years. Like most former consultants, you go check something out and then decide what you want to be when you grow up. And still trying to grow up 20 years later. So that's the career trajectory for me. Maybe one more thing in terms of the personal experience. You really realize that in life you have to be resilient. And I had some real health challenges with my back when I was a kid and in and out of school. And so you learn how to be flexible through that. And coming full circle to where my career has ended up, really like that about our industry, because it's an industry that's really built on resiliency and flexibility, but it's also built on collaboration. So when you think about the big events that we face, there's an automatic structure built in for all of us to compare notes and help each other out. And there's things like, trade groups like the Edison Electric Institute that both Joe's and my company are members of, the Electricity Subsector Coordinating Council, that's a meeting place between our industry and government. And so, work with federal partners there. But that sense of mutual assistance really feeds the flexibility and resiliency of our industry. And it's something that's pretty unique, and I think we're pretty proud of.
That's amazing. That, many times you don't see companies collaborating that much. And it's always so heartening to see that in a crisis. That's kind of when people tend to come together. But it's great to see that the energy industry is doing it just as a matter of course. That's great. Joe, how about you?
Yeah, well, first of all, good afternoon, good morning to everyone. I think Pedro said it right. We all kind of self-select for this business. And so my background, I grew up in a family of immigrants from Cuba, New Jersey. My dad was a sheet metal man, and he had a great ambition to own the sheet metal shop that he was working in. And at some point in time, I don't know, when I was 11 or 12 years old, he was able to do that and buy out the owner. And immediately after that, I think we had the Arab oil embargo and a whole bunch of different economic unrest. And if you watch Saturday Night Live, like I did as a kid, and you saw the original cast, you might remember Rosanna, Ratner's famous character, who would always say, if it's not one thing, it's the other. That great accent. That was my dad. And so we would sit around the dinner table every night and talk about the latest challenge or opportunity for the business. And it's remarkable how my life hasn't changed all that much. It seems like it's a different challenge and an opportunity. And as Pedro said, it's a great fraternity of people who run these businesses, because great, as you noted, we really aren't competitors. We all have our part of the country that we're responsible for. And here at ComEd, we care for 4 million families and businesses. I know Pedro's got a huge group of customers that he has to look out for every day. And so in events like this, we draw strength and also support great ideas from each other. And it works out very well.
Very good. Thank you. And Joe, my father's family's from Cuba, so there you go.
We got a good Caribbean connection going on.
Exactly, yeah, perfect. Okay, so Joe, you took the helm of ComEd 2 years ago, and now you get to deal with a global pandemic. We know that power companies have extensive and well-tested disaster preparedness plans, but when the pandemic crisis first hit, how did your disaster plans apply? And then secondly, what were the most pressing focus areas for you and especially your board? We have a lot of board members here on the call today, and I'm sure they'd like to hear, what were some of the priorities for you and the board?
Yeah, well, I got a call from a politician here in Illinois. I don't want to say who it is, but got a call from a politician here in Illinois saying, everything is going to depend on the grid operating at this point. The difference between us having an orderly society and one that is chaos is going to be power continuing to flow. I'm sure Pedro had the same feeling. And, when you witness the events of the summer, you kind of you understand that those stakes weren't overstated. We did have a good disaster recovery plan, a pandemic plan. In terms of its content, it was right on. In terms of its execution, we ran into challenges right away, mostly in the way that other businesses did in terms of securing PPE, hand sanitizer, and other things that we needed to run the operations. We had put in, when we had seen the events unfolding in China at the beginning of the year and some risk of a pandemic, we had put in a big order with 3M for these masks that everybody wanted at the beginning of this. And what we soon confronted is that while we had a good contract and we had the order placed timely and all of that, we didn't get delivery of the goods. And likewise for other key components. So we had to resort to innovative ideas. We worked with local distilleries, for example, to create hand sanitizers, created our own masks, that sort of thing. But those were the challenges. I think from the board perspective, they wanted to make sure that we're doing everything for the safety of our employees, unlike a lot of American businesses that were able to work remotely. We had 60+% of our people that had to come in to work the next day. And so I remember getting on those telephone calls and being a relatively new CEO who I've been with Exelon for 20 years, but only with ComEd for a couple. And, you just think about what you remember from the early days where we really didn't know a whole lot about this illness. There were a lot of horror stories. We didn't know how it was transmitted. You had to wipe down your grocery products when you brought them home and that sort of thing. I didn't know how it would affect children. And we had a lot of questions from our people. But what the other great thing about this business is the mission focus. And their first question was, where do you want us to show up tomorrow? Mm-hmm. And they did, and they've shown up all of the time. In terms of the business impacts, we're still studying that. What we found is that all of our models to understand the economic impact of a crisis like this are inadequate. They're based on prior recessions like the 2008 financial crisis and the aftermath of that, which, as we've kind of played into the future, don't really track the economic impacts that we've seen. So we're still wrestling that to the ground. But it's the classic difference between having a good plan and what was it that Mike Tyson said? All your strategy goes away the first time you're in the fight. And that kind of played itself out. But the resilience of the organization, the fact, as Pedro said, that we are organizations that are built on tackling crisis, really just helped to innovate a way through this.
Great, thank you, Joe. Pedro, how about for your company?
Well, I'll start by saying that I've known Joe a long time, but the range that he's shown now, from Rosanna Dana to Mike Tyson, I'm just impressed. I love this. Very similar. And, again, this is really ingrained in the industry, right? Preparing for resiliency, having corporate level emergency response plans. Be honest with you, for our company, that really got honed starting around, after 2011, because we had a series of windstorms back then where the company at the utility level, I was with a different part of the company at the time, but at the utility level, we did not respond like we needed to. It was an unprecedented set of windstorms that had a big impact on the grid, but it showed that our ability to manage something of that scale was not what it needed to be. And so that led to a period of, bringing in new staff. We have a director of business resiliency who was recruited after that, who used to be a senior person at FEMA, really whipped us into shape in terms of using the incident command system, which is what federal authorities and law enforcement use to self-organize during crisis. And it's a modular system that can build out, the larger the crisis, the more you can build that out. And it allows us to use the same language through the National Incident Management System as those first responders are using. So I think like ComEd, Southern California Edison had not only business resiliency plans, but had a pandemic plan. I'll be very honest with you here. I think we were well prepared at one level. At another level, with a 1 in 100-year pandemic, we spent the first few weeks going through so many decisions and choices, including policies that we had not foreseen the need for, right? And comparing notes with my peers, I think we were all in a similar boat. How do you think about, I'll give you an example, time off, right? How do you think about telework, right? What support do you provide for employees for teleworking? We have 2/3 of our employees who we sent home. We actually did that a couple of days before the California governor put in his stay-at-home order. So I'm proud that we, saw it coming and responded even before we got told to do that. We still have 2/3 folks at home. And we've told them that we used to think they might be as early as Labor Day that we'd be back. And we changed that recently and said it won't be any earlier than the beginning of the new year. And even then, it won't be everybody in one shot, right? So it'll be a process. So a lot of stuff that was very well assisted and supported by the planning we had done. But when you plan, you recognize that part of the plan is going through the thought process. Part of the plan is then giving you a thought process so you can respond with different thoughts when you're actually in the middle of it, and collaborate with others who are going through the same thing. I mentioned the ESCC before, this industry federal government collaboration body. Chris Crane, the corporate CEO at Joe's company at Exelon, sits on that. So, Chris and I and something like 30 other corporate CEOs from across the country were on the phone. It was once a week. I think some weeks we had twice a week. We're now down to once every other week. And we were on the phone with our partners from DOE, from other agencies. I serve on the Secretary of Energy's advisory board, so I have discussions through that vehicle as well. Everybody, I think, was trying to respond to this and recognizing that there was new ground that was being trod here, and therefore new policies and new approaches that had to be created. Maybe one other thing I'll share here is that the communications with our employees and with the board really were a critical part to the response, right? So it's not just setting the policies and figuring out who needs to be in the field and who stays home and how you support all that, but just a sense of presence with your employees at a time like this is just critical. Yeah. And so we had already established a practice of something like quarterly, we would do these all company live streams, which is really two-way communication with the entire company. And I'll usually host those, or I have the head of Southern California Edison with me, right? A couple other executives. And we'll get on a format like this, and we'll have thousands of folks dialed in. And then we have a feature where they can then ask us questions and provide comments through a chat stream, a chat box. And they can rate each other's comments, so you can crowdsource what people really want to talk about. That's created a sense of presence that was just critical. And we took what used to be a quarterly event, that became a weekly event for the first several months. We're now down to every other week of having these all company conversations. But critical vehicle to provide information, to hear concerns, and frankly, just to be there. Right? Just to be there with your team. Regarding the board, similarly, the cadence of the board meetings went way up. And In the first couple of months, we were probably having meetings weekly, every couple of weeks. That's now, gone into more normal cadence, lots of communication in between. At one point, I joked with our board members that if we didn't watch it, their hourly rate was going to go down to like fast food levels, because it was just a lot of time spent. And by the way, this is with a board. It's a terrific board. It's a diverse board. It's a board that's already been going through a lot of intensity in California with the wildfire issues.
Yeah.
So we already had that crisis, and then we've been working our way through it, and now we had this other crisis to deal with. Maybe final thought is that as we communicate with the board and with our employee group, the visual image I had started using back during just the wildfire period, and I carried forward to this as so important to deal with the near-term issue, but not forget the long-term, right? And for those of us who are in a certain age group who remember the old TV variety shows where every few weeks there'd be the guy on there who would be spinning plates, remember, with like 10 plates spinning and keeping them going. That's what it feels like, right? You have to spin the big platter of the near-term crisis, but you can't forget about the other plates you need to keep spinning that are so critical to the long-term viability of the company and, frankly, the role that we play in our society. So in California, for us, it's, for example, all the tools around decarbonizing the economy, right? And using clean energy to electrify a lot of society. And so I've been proud of the team being able to deal with the near-term stuff, those crises, yet not lose the eye on the ball and keep the work going on that important transformative work.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you, Pedro. Good perspective. On the three boards that I sit on, there have been insights and changes, lots of changes made that these companies are going to keep even after the crisis is over. I mean, some of them. Pedro, have you had a similar experience, and what kinds of things that have come out of the crisis do you see becoming permanent as we move, past that phase?
Yeah, absolutely. And this is not just us, but I mean, I'm seeing this with our peers, and I'm seeing this really across the economy. In California, I sit on the governor's task force for business and jobs recovery, which was established to help the economy come out of the pandemic. And importantly there, the governor set the charge of looking not just at the near-term resolution, but also then thinking about these long-term issues, as well as thinking about it all from a social equity perspective, right? Because these changes, the good stuff that we can get out of this needs to be there not only for those who have, but also for those who have not. So for us, I mentioned that 2/3 of our employees, around 8,500 employees, have been teleworking. One obvious change is that when this is all over, or whenever we find whatever the new normal is, we're not going back to the way it was 5 months ago, right? And I don't think that our average office worker is going to go back to sitting in their office or their cubicle, 8 or 9 hours a day, 5 days a week in that physical space, right? It will be safe at some point. Hopefully, we all pray, right, and hope that it'll be safe to go back to that. But we have seen that first, we've been able to use the technology tools in a way that got deeply accelerated by the crisis. It's an awful reason to have needed it, but it is a silver lining in this, right? And if you had asked me 5 or 6 months ago, were we really using the power of telework tools like video chatting, like a number of the other digital tools that we have, I would have told you no, and I want us to use more of that. And it'll probably take us 5 years to go through the change management and the technology deployment and blah, blah, blah. Did it in, a week.
Right.
And crisis creates a platform for that. So we are seeing places where there are productivity enhancements to come from this. Point one. Point two, we're seeing an important angle in terms of sustainability, right? Because we've taken vehicle miles traveled off the road. Now, in the future, we hope that many more of those vehicle miles traveled will be electric and have a lesser impact on the environment. But better yet, to not travel the mile at all, right? And then thirdly, flexibility for employees, right? So we don't envision, though, that new normal will be one where we continue to work remotely 100% of the time. And that's because, I read a quote recently, and it was one of the technology CEOs, but I unfortunately don't remember which one it was. But he said something along the lines of, this is working well now because we're all leveraging the existing social capital that we had and existing relationships and existing norms and values, right? At some point, you need to feed that again. The medium we're using right now, video, works okay. I still think that physical human interaction is important. People in a room, better able to see the body language, being able to have the side discussion on the way to the water cooler or whatever. There's a lot of fabric, network that gets built among human beings when you do that. So we're envisioning that there's a hybrid world ahead of us, which will depend by role, right? And so we're doing the analysis right now, role by role. That's work that we started early on. We had a team focus on the near-term response. We set a team aside to be able to think clearly about the long term without being saddled by what was going on in terms of the near-term response. And so we're going through job category by job category, painting a picture of what the new normal will look like. And I think for a lot of job categories, there'll be a hybrid mode where maybe you're working from home 2 or 3 days a week, and maybe you're in the office for a couple of days. And that has implications for, does that mean you have a fixed office or not? Is there shared space? Is there a way to optimize real estate? Those are longer term questions that we'll face. Final thing I'll say is that we've also seen changes in terms of how we communicate and engage with our customers and our communities. And Joe alluded to this, but with the crisis, the importance of electricity simply went up, right? Because it's not just electricity at the workplace, now it's at the home for people who are trying to work and study from home. And we saw deep sensitivity in a number of our communities to the work that we need to do to maintain the grid, which can often require a planned outage to do that work safely. And communities telling us, please you can't take an outage right now because everybody's working from home. And our answer was, we'll be thoughtful about deferring outages that don't need to happen right then, but there's work we need to do to keep you safe, to keep our workers safe, to keep your power resilient. But that forced us to quickly develop some better digital tools that frankly we should have had already. They give us better visibility and give those communities better visibility into the work that's coming up, 2-week look ahead window that we can then share with government officials. And that to me is part of the new normal. That was something we developed because of this. We should have had that, and we will have that, moving forward. So it's, there's a number of examples like that through our business platform. Where we'll keep those changes.
That's awesome. Thank you, Pedro. How about you, Joe? What are your thoughts on that?
I think Pedro said everything I would want to say and said it better. I think we do need to just keep in mind that our success has been driven by the momentum we had from working in the office for 100 years together and that kind of culture that's been developed. I don't think we are ever going to move to a situation where we have all the people who are remote now always working from remote, but we will have job categories that we never dreamed of having people work from home. I'll give you, for example, we have a call center with over 400 people. We always believed that we needed to have that call center on site to observe the telephone calls with our customers, drive productivity, make sure that we've got the right sentiment touch, all those other things. We were wrong, and we thought that way for decades. Even in the face of other companies going to remote call centers, we thought ours was the best mechanism. We're right now getting the same or better results with people working remotely. But there are other functions where, because we have a workforce that has to be in the field no matter what, you want to create that intimate bond between the back office and the people who are out in the field. And that happens through face-to-face interaction. And I don't think we're ever going to let go of a lot of that. But is it going to be 5 days a week? I don't think so. I think it'll be 3 days a week and shared space and that sort of thing. And then the final point, Grace, while everybody sounds like everybody's cheering for us and we're all, barring off of each other, there are a lot of threat vectors that we've seen escalate. So our cybersecurity risks, and if there's probably one thing that keeps Pedro and I both up at night, is the risk of losing control of the grid through a cyber attack. We see hundreds of millions of attempted attacks on our system annually. And so we've seen, an uptick in the way that nation state actors, all the way to kids in the basement are trying to take advantage of these opportunities, take advantage of our customers and their vulnerabilities. So we just got to continue to up our game. And in certain of these circumstances, having the remote stuff enables the technology, but the technology is the risk of having people get onto our systems and do bad things. So we just got to balance all of that. And it is a big puzzle to solve. I think it is not going to get solved in the next 6 months. It's going to be something we're going to be talking about in this business for 10 years, like other American businesses.
Yeah. Joe, that's interesting because I just read an article a day or two ago about hackers that are targeting specifically remote employees from energy companies who are working remotely. I mean, exactly to your point. That's a new vulnerability, I guess I'd say, that I'm sure you all are dealing with now that we probably didn't have to deal with before.
It's incredible, Grace. We had a circumstance a couple of weeks ago, and we have a team that constantly is patrolling the dark web to look at threat vectors, and they play as participants in the dark web to try to figure things out. We discovered a replica of our ComEd customer portal, everything you could get to through our internet connections with customers. There was an actual duplicate of that on the dark web. It hadn't been, we were able to get it before it actually started to do anything bad, but it's been pretty amazing. And there's a bunch of secret stuff that we get briefed on all the time that there are a lot of bad actors out there.
Yeah.
Just a little tangent on that, Grace, if I could, because I'm glad Joe brought that up. I mean, it is something that all of us spend a lot of time on. And the reality is that if you are particularly a nation state actor or a terrorist actor or what have you, and you want to do damage to the U.S. economy, the electric grid is a very logical place to go for. That ESCC group that I mentioned also manages cybersecurity for the industry, and it's been a really good government partnership. One of those things that I'm thankful every day has been very apolitical, so it really got strengthened up during the Obama administration. It has continued strong during the Trump administration, because I think everybody understands that this is just one that you can't mess with. Exactly. But one of the things that we do as an industry is do some very significant collaboration, but also exercising, training, simulation. And so we do these national level exercises to simulate cyber attacks, joint cyber physical attacks. It's also tremendous information sharing with our federal partners. Joe mentioned secret information. A number of us have clearances. We get the intelligence from government. We provide intelligence back. And importantly, this is an area where utilities are being asked by the federal government to do things in the interest of national security. So one of the things that we've been advocating for is to get liability protection, so that if we get a call from name your favorite three-letter agency asking us to do something or not do something, that's something we're doing in the interest of national security. And so for those of you who are directors, we spend a lot of time with our board on cyber. We talk about this issue. We want to make sure we do the right thing for the country, but we also need to make sure that we're protecting the company when we do that, because there's liability that we can incur if the government asks us to restore power to a military facility before we go to a hospital. It can be shareholder litigation over that, or if they ask us to keep a threat alive so the government can study it, but then something goes boom with that threat. We need that protection. Is something we've been working in Congress to try and achieve.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah, that's a different perspective on that whole topic. Good thoughts. Well, I know that both of your companies have been working on many efforts to produce clean energy. We're going to move to that topic. Yeah. So, Pedro, you've been an advocate for aggressive decarbonization goals. How has the pandemic affected your pace of meeting those goals, or even your plans?
So I think the short answer is it has not affected the long-term view at all. But we recognize there may be near-term impacts. Let me dive a little deeper into that. First, I should say, as an industry, the electric industry has already achieved a lot of reduction in greenhouse gas emissions over the last couple of decades. And the investor-owned utilities like, Joe's and ours that are members of the Edison Electric Institute have reduced even more compared to the rest of the country. In California, we live in a state that as a subnational entity has signed on to the goals of the Paris Accord. We as a company have signed on to that as well. We look forward to the day when the United States signs back on to that. Which is the right thing to do. But at the same time, I will say that while this administration has not done that, fortunately, the work has continued. And so entities like the Department of Energy in fact, the science budget of the Department of Energy is higher than ever and being used for important areas like electric vehicles and battery storage and the like. In California, with the state having a target to decarbonize the economy by 2045, we did some pretty seminal work starting a few years ago to look beyond each of the various point requirements that the state has and put it all together and develop an economy-wide view of what it will take for California to get that net zero point by 2045. And what we found was that it'll take a lot of different arrows in the quiver, but the cheapest way to get there and the most feasible way will rely a lot on the electric sector, right? And that means using a lot of clean energy, including renewable energy, with a lot of storage to help manage the volatility of wind and solar resources to then repower a lot of the economy where today we burn fossil fuels. And so that means things like, we believe for our state, having 100% clean energy by 2045, adding significant amount of new energy in order to meet that, and then electrifying 3/4 of passenger vehicles by 2045, electrifying about 1/3 of heavy-duty vehicles because those are harder to electrify. 70% of building space and water heating needs will need to be electric. So you get the sense it's a big lift across the economy, but it'll take a lot of tools, right? And not just the electric side tools. We'll need a role for clean fuels like hydrogen to be part of the solution, particularly for processes that are hard to electrify. And so we'll also need carbon capture. That may be through forest lands. That may be through direct air capture. A lot of things there that will be in the mix. But importantly, it's a pretty big vision for how the state gets there. It requires a lot of investment. The near-term challenge that comes up with COVID is taking the steps over the next couple of years. We know that, for example, with the impacts of the economy, a lot of consumers may not be out in the market for a new vehicle next year, let alone an electric vehicle. So we may see some delays in the curve, but the ultimate end goal has to stay the same, frankly, given the urgency globally of addressing the issue of climate. And this is a transition that needs to be done not only for, to joke a little bit here, for folks like probably most folks on this Zoom call who can afford the bigger, more expensive Tesla model. This needs to be a transition also for folks who can't, who will need to rely on getting a secondhand Bolt and need to make sure that they have access to charging infrastructure in their apartment building in a low-income community, right? So as utilities, we can play a role in helping to facilitate that transition by having programs like the number of programs we propose and are working on right now that look at creating those incentives for that long-term picture, but that do things in the near term, and importantly, that don't leave those disadvantaged communities behind in the near term. One last thought to close this off is that it will require investment in the near term, but from a societal perspective, the good news here is that because the electric technologies are so much more efficient, when we run the math on this, we believe that the average customer in 2045 will actually be spending 1/3 less across all energy sources. Wow. Add up what they spend today on gasoline and on natural gas, on electricity. They'll use more electricity because they won't be fueling their car with gas, it'll be electric. But when you add up the entire energy footprint, they will spend 1/3 less if society moves down this path just because of that inherent efficiency of an electric motor versus pouring gasoline in a tank, and burning it in an engine and losing a lot of that energy to heat and to friction.
Well, that's compelling, right?
Follow the money.
Yeah, exactly. Well, and like you said before, it's one of those long-term plates that we just got to keep spinning as we work through this, the near term here. Joe, additional thoughts?
Yeah, and I might take it in a slightly different direction. I think the question is broader than climate. I think the question is about air pollution. And one of the interesting things as you get into the climate science, whether you believe there are a variety of different models that are run, and whether you believe the most aggressive carbon reduction model or the least aggressive, kind of the do nothing status quo model, the impact in our global climate between now and 2050 is largely the same. That is to say, whether we decarbonize to a great degree or to a little degree, the bad stuff that's going to happen in the climate is going to happen over the next 3 decades, and there's not material differences. The reason we ought to be doing it is for our kids and for the survival of the planet long term, and we're certainly committed to that. But there's a nearer term challenge, something that we could effectuate immediately that does have an impact on the health of people in the communities, and it is electrification, to the point that Pedro made. But let me give you a little bit of the COVID overlay. When we think about Chicago, it has some of the worst air quality in the nation. Southern California, Los Angeles area air quality is very poor as well. New York, places with a lot of vehicle traffic have bad air pollution. That's just bad ozone pollution. In terms of respiratory illnesses, we're second only to Los Angeles and New York in terms of new respiratory illnesses. And there's been a dialogue that's been going on in our region here for the last 4 or 5 years around life expectancy. And what we see in Chicago on the south side is that life expectancies for largely Black and Latino communities are on average 26 years shorter than they are for their counterparts on the north side of Chicago, that are largely white communities. It's one of these breathtaking statistics. United Way has done a lot of analysis around that. And the reasons for it are all things, diet, exercise, the availability of medicine and doctors, and all the things that we know are connected to health. But one of the things that we do know is that we could look at the neighborhoods surrounding Chicago, and that these areas also have the most pervasive air pollution. And the American Medical Association talked about being in Chicago and living there as being the functional equivalent of smoking a pack of cigarettes each day. And that's inclusive of kids in poor neighborhoods. So where I think we're going to be able to make immediate impacts is as we think about these local sources of pollution, we're going to be thinking about the same things Pedro is talking about from a climate perspective, but we're going to be thinking about it from the perspective of cleaning up the air in these neighborhoods, air that we've seen has had a direct consequence where the most severe effects of COVID have been on these communities. Not surprising. They have poor health walking into it, poor air quality, and disproportionately we see fatalities and severe illnesses out of COVID, following the air pollution maps. And I think that is going to renew the call for action around clean energy and a commitment in a way that we haven't seen before. This is something that could be debated, and you could look at the polling data and make your case one way or the other. But for Latinos and African Americans, or just poor people, the call to action around climate change is strong, but they have more immediate issues that they face in their daily lives. Some of the equity issues we're talking about. So when we're talking about an investment in beneficial electrification or electrification in neighborhoods in different places to improve localized air quality, I think what we're talking about is what I call an energy health equity nexus, where the utilities call to action isn't about saving the planet and is dependent on things that are going to happen in other countries. These are things that we could be doing to preserve our communities right now. And I think, as I said, I think that's going to drive clean energy adoption to a greater degree. But whereas previously the focus has been on the energy sector largely, getting wind, solar built, those things, those are critical. In Illinois, we see more bang for the buck in terms of climate reductions through electrification. 92% of the energy I'm providing to customers today comes from zero emission sources. far and away the national leader. Exelon is far and away the national leader in terms of the production of zero emission energy. But where we aren't making progress is on the transportation sector, where policy is lagging is there, on industrial uses, on residential uses, where we still see a lot of oil-fired heat in the city that's contributing to fine particulates. All of those things now are going to come into focus, and they're going to come into focus not from just an environmental perspective, but from an equity perspective, and how we improve the quality of life in neighborhoods that have been devastated by COVID and other forces.
Wow.
Hey, Joe, I think it is really both of those. And I'm glad you brought up the nexus to air quality. Southern California, those of you who know the LA area, we have two of the country's largest ports, and then you have freeways that cut through there with trucks, diesel trucks, going through some of our most disadvantaged neighborhoods. So when we think about transportation electrification, we do think it's important for climate, and we do think there's a role that we need to play to demonstrate the technologies, because I do think they affect the model. So we can talk about the science, separately. But from an air quality perspective, I'll put in my PhD hat on that one. But from an air quality perspective, I totally agree with you. And frankly, taking a diesel truck off the road has maybe less of an impact on the broad greenhouse gas emissions piece. It has a huge impact on the air quality piece. And for us, it's all disadvantaged communities. So I totally agree on that part.
Good.
And Chris, just to give you one analytic that for people to take away, the American Lung Association did a study for California for their air quality and concluded that for every gallon of gasoline or diesel we burn in California, we're creating 74 cents of adjacent healthcare costs.
Oh.
Those are the asthma cases, the respiratory illnesses, the shortened lives, countless lives. So 74 cents a gallon of healthcare costs and we're doing the same study here in Illinois now. But it's shocking if you were to think about the analytics for greenhouse gas, even if you believed all the greenhouse gas science, the full societal cost of carbon, the impact of a gallon burned is about 30 to 40 cents of climate impact.
That's
so
amazing.
The healthcare impact is 2 to 1.
Right. Well, we have one more question before we open it up for Q&A, and we'll have just a couple of minutes for each of you to answer this question. But, you both touched on it. Beyond the pandemic and the whole economic fallout, we've seen social unrest that the nation has been struggling with, specifically around systemic racism and inequality. So, Joe, I'm going to ask you first to talk a little bit about what's going on at ComEd around diversity and addressing systemic racism, and then Pedro, to ask you to do the same. A couple minutes each would be great. Thank you.
Yeah, I mean, we've focused on diverse hiring. We're about 50% women and people of color right now, up significantly over the past 10 years. We've quadrupled the spending we have with businesses owned by women and people of color. That accounts for about $750 million of annual spend by ComEd with those vendors now. So I think about 41 cents of every dollar we spend is with businesses owned by women and people of color. And we're obviously focused on increasing representation on our board. I saw one of the questions from Nelson Diaz on the chat that was funny. I'll get to that. But we're constantly focused on this issue. But again, I return to, we got to do everything to ensure diverse and inclusive workforce and do everything we can in our supply chain, and we will affect the lives of thousands, if not tens of thousands of people. But if we deal with the climate and the air quality issues, we're going to affect change in the lives of millions of people. That is going to be the big driver for social equity at ComEd, in addition to the programs. I was very proud that our company stood up and took a leadership position. I know EEI companies have followed on the Black Lives Matter movement. Saying those words were important to Exelon and to ComEd and to all of our employees, and very well received. But the question is now, what's next? What are we going to do to actually get traction on those goals? And so we're busy at work doing that. We understand that we anteed up here, but there's a lot more to do to play the hand.
Thanks, Joe. Good, good progress, and it there's no easy answers, that's for sure. I mean, it's definitely a journey. Pedro, I read a letter, impassioned letter that you sent to your Edison teams in the wake of George Floyd's tragic death. I read that on LinkedIn, actually. It was a really great letter. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I mean, similar to Joe, it is important to say the words and say them out loud and loudly. And so we've been focused on diversity and inclusion for a long time. Starts with our board. 7 out of the 11 of us on the Edison International board are diverse. 4 women, diversity in terms of ethnic background, LGBTQ, et cetera. Something like 70% of our employee population is diverse, gender and ethnically. So we reflect our community today. We'd like to see, frankly, more diversity at senior levels. Although, as we look at our stats against market availability, we're kind of right in line, but there's a role that we can play to then help the market better reflect society. So right now, though, the discussion around particularly the Black community and African American community has been very pointed, because it's about not just now, but it's a history of 400 years worth of oppression that began with slavery. And so it is important to acknowledge that that's a different experience that's being called out, and in the context of the injustice that we see more broadly against communities of color across the spectrum. So important to do that. Agree with Joe. You got to speak. You also have to listen, though. You have to understand, and then figure out what else should we be doing as a company to help accelerate society. One thing that you'll see us do, you've already seen us do, transparency is really important in terms of data. I was shocked to learn that it's actually only a small percentage of companies that share publicly the data that they have to submit to the EEOC on representation. So for those of you who are directors, ask your management teams if they're disclosing that in public. We do. We've done that for a long time. We added pay diversity data for gender a couple of years ago and disclosed that publicly. And we are planning, probably towards the end of this month, we're going to do a broader release that will include our pay equity data by ethnic category, for our employees. I'm not aware of any other Fortune 500 companies that are doing that today. And so hopefully there's 1 or 2 that we've missed, but it's certainly not the prevalent step. And I'm hoping that we can encourage our peers to do that, because transparency is first step. But like Joe, we also focus on the impact in the communities. Our supplier diversity spend, also around 40 cents out of every dollar, and our charitable work in the communities.
Thank you, Pedro. And along the transparency issue, I read that ISS is suggesting that boards also disclose ethnicity of their boards. Right. Companies disclose the ethnicity of their boards.
Which we do already.
Yeah, and many companies don't, but
many companies don't have much diversity to report.
That's true. That is true. There you go.
There's that.
Well, good. Thank you both. Really good discussion on those topics. We'd now like to open up the discussion for our Zoom participants with Q&A for Joe and Pedro. Please remember to use the Zoom chat tool to indicate that you have a question, and our host will queue those up, and then we'll call on you. So let's see, Commissioner, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced, Sadzi Olivia. We've got a question there. Carmen, did we? Okay, well, while we're, oh, there we go.
Are you on? Can you hear us? She's the Illinois Commerce Commission. We'd love for you to chime in if you have any thoughts.
Okay, yes. Can you all hear me?
It's a little broken up, but
we can hear you though.
Yeah.
Okay. Sorry, I have a video, but it's in my office and I'm working remotely at home. So I'm so glad that Jose Perez me the invitation for this event. This is the first time I have participated at an LCDA webinar. And one thing I just want to say is that I'm so happy to see so many Hispanic leaders in this virtual chat room. It's really inspiring. For those of you who don't know me, Lena in Illinois, and I started this position in 2017. So that's a lot about where we are in terms of Latinos leadership across the country. So I work nationally at an organization on the Supplier and Workforce Diversity Subcommittee, hoping to increase the numbers of diverse workers in the utility industry as well as suppliers. So if any of you ever have, great ideas or you want to help me present, I would love to hear from you. And again, I'm just really happy to be part of this conversation, and I just feel lucky to be here.
Great, thank you. Thanks for participating. We really appreciate it. Okay, again, if there's any questions, please, let's see. There's a question here by Jose Perez, and I'll read it. If we pull up Jose, I'll let him go through it. But Hispanics have experienced discrimination as a Black community, as well as a Black community. How can corporations bring balanced attention to really both sides? The point is, it's not just the Black community; it's also the Hispanic community. So, Joe or Pedro?
Yeah. Actually, I'm happy to chip in. It's because that's been a discussion, among our employees. We're in Southern California, and so the Black community represents something like 6 or 7% of the population. The Latino community, Latinx community is much larger percentage, probably up in the 40% or so. Jose, I'm glad you asked a question. I'll give you the honest answer. Both really matter. And obviously, as we think about our diversity and inclusion programs, they really are about including everyone. And in our community, that the Hispanic, Latinx community is a major part of that. At the same time, there's a national discussion right now that was triggered by the senseless murders of Black individuals. And so I do think that while not losing sight of the importance of making sure that we're doing the right thing across the spectrum, and in particular for the Latinx community, it is important to make sure that we don't lose this moment to talk about the Black community too, because that's a very specific set of issues that have a different origin and merit this. I heard that, well, to be honest with you, we also get employees who sometimes say, well, don't all lives matter, or don't blue lives matter? And yes, I agree, they do. But somebody used an analogy recently that it's like being in a pool, all lives matter, you want to make sure nobody's drowning. But if somebody's drowning at that instant, you want to give them the life preserver. And let's face it, there's been a moment that's a life preserver moment for the Black community that we can't ignore. So it's balance.
Yeah, thank you, Pedro. Joe, any additional thoughts?
No, I think that is the issue. It's the issue of balance and trying to make sure that as we emphasize diversity across the board, we don't lose sight of the importance of dealing with this issue around police misconduct that, let's be honest, has been plaguing us for years and years. And we have seen it repeatedly. That's not to say it doesn't affect other communities, but it has a very disproportionate effect on the African American community. And so I think as we pivot forward, the importance, I know there's a lot of Latino leaders on this telephone call, the importance is not to react to where am I in this spotlight, but to rather understand that this is a point in time, as Pedro said, where we're called to take action on one particular issue. As time goes on and in the fullness of time, all of the equity issues, including gender issues and sexual orientation issues, and all of those will come back into the fore. We can't allow jealousy over the spotlight to impact how we react here. We just need to understand that equity issues broadly benefit us all broadly. even if we're talking about one specific sliver of the problem.
Yeah, well said, well said. The next question is, how supportive are your boards to ensure energy equity, especially for underserved populations? And then what's the push for action by boards on this topic?
If you don't mind, Pedro, I'll jump in.
Go ahead, Joe.
There's certainly no reluctance in terms of the board to deal with the issue, but how we describe it and how we bring attention to this issue in this moment is something that I think folks are still trying to wrestle with the words and the dialogue around it. But I think it's fair to say that traditionally we probably looked at it around the same sorts of things that are bringing us together here as this group investigates board representation, supplier diversity, workforce diversity and inclusion. Those are the things that we would have thought about as equity. And of course, in our business, the programs that we have that specifically work for the benefit of our most vulnerable, financially challenged customers, our low-income programs, that sort of thing. So that was the discussion around equity at Exelon. And what we're doing now is inviting a broader discussion that includes all of those things, but also includes access to the new technologies that we expect to see. So to the point that Pedro made, it's not just rich people in the burbs that buy the Teslas or have a roof big enough for solar panels. We need to find opportunities for people who don't own a home or in multi-dwelling homes or can't afford an electric vehicle to benefit. So that's public transportation, public buses, trains, school buses, that sort of thing, and making sure policy, treats those opportunities equally or better. And, likewise, I think on the health issues that we're talking about around reducing air pollution, I think our company was very comfortable with the climate discussion and framing things around that, less comfortable and less analytically astute around the issues of localized air pollution and how, as an electric company, we could effectuate change. So I think there's a great thirst for thinking about how we benefit millions of lives, but I think we're still working through the policy pieces, how we talk about it with policymakers and with our customers, because let's be honest, there's a cost to these things that also pulls against affordability issues that we need to keep an eye on.
Great, thank you, Joe. Anything to add,
Yeah,
Pedro?
this is an area where California has stepped up over a number of years, and there's a real need. 1/3 of Southern California Edison's residential customers qualify for low-income assistance, and we have something like 40-some% of the state's disadvantaged communities are in our territory. So this is a real issue. I agree with what Joe said. Maybe just add to that. It's got to translate into real programs, right, that are targeting the communities with real money and real action. So, for example, we have a program that the Commission is considering right now that would help deploy 48,000 charging stations for passenger vehicles over the next 4 or 5 years or so. We recently got a proposed decision in that scales the program down just a little bit, but still would approve it. A significant part of that proposal targets deploying charging infrastructure in disadvantaged communities, in multi-unit dwellings, deals with the issues of these being locations that would need likely, smaller deployments, but you need a large volume of them. So having the programs actually target the communities actively, whether it's programs like that, whether it's our supplier diversity, spending that we both mentioned already. With that, it's not just what you spend, but it's how you help build up businesses. So a big part of our investment has been in educational programs to help that, fledgling new business owner develop their small business into one that can compete with larger businesses in our, solicitations. And then finally, on the charitable giving side, we contribute at least $20 million a year across the corporation from our shareholder dollars. It's not in anybody's rates, but something like 80% of that spend today goes towards underserved populations because that's where the impact is the largest.
Thank you, Pedro. Thanks, both of you. Okay, so we are nearing the end of this. We're going to do a very quick lightning round. I'm going to ask you one question and a minute or less answer. And again, bring it back to boards. What was the single most helpful thing that your board has done during this crisis? So Pedro, I'll start with you.
Thank you. They've been terrific. They've been great. And they've had the right balance between oversight and support. And frankly, with a pandemic like this, you are figuring a lot of stuff out. So their presence and engagement and support have just been fantastic, off the charts. They're a resilient board.
Awesome, thank you. Joe?
Yeah, same thing. They've acted very quickly. We've had, we have had a heavy cadence of board meetings, but because our customers were affected, they weren't paying their bills, they weren't using energy the same way. It brought near-term liquidity issues to the forefront, and so the board acted very quickly to help us approve debt financing and other things that we needed to do to keep going, and frankly are still going to be things that are going to be challenges. The federal government did a good job stepping in early on with the initial relief package, which solidified the financial markets, particularly the commercial paper market, and we've seen the benefits of that. But I think the best thing that boards do in these circumstances is give management teams a lot of room to maneuver, understanding that they're going to need that, and that frankly, it's uncertain out there.
Yeah, thank you. Well, that is great advice for all of us board members to react with our boards. So thank you for both of that. So we are going to be closing out this session. I'd like to just start by thanking Joe and Pedro for joining us and sharing their really valuable insight. I mean, that was incredible. I have learned more about the energy industry, and it's you guys have tough jobs, but you obviously do it really well. So thank you. I'd also like to thank Anthony Castellanos for his opening remarks. Big thank you to Esther and LCDA for hosting this, and so many other great events. So, thank you for all that effort. And Esther, for your team as well. And then finally, thanks to all the participants for your engagement and great questions. There will be a feedback form that will be emailed to all of you after the session. We'd really appreciate your input so that the team can continue to improve as we go forward. And with that, we are all set. Everyone have a wonderful day.